Middlemarch, A Study of Provincial Life is a novel by English author George Eliot, first published in 8 installments during 1871–2. The novel is set in the fictitious Midlands town of Middlemarch during 1829–32, and it comprises several distinct stories and a large cast of characters. Significant themes include the status of women, the nature of marriage, idealism, self-interest, religion, hypocrisy, political reform, and education. Although containing comical elements, Middlemarch is a work of realism that refers to many historical events: the 1832 Reform Act, the beginnings of the railways, the death of King George IV, and the succession of his brother, the Duke of Clarence. In addition, the work incorporates contemporary medical science and examines the deeply reactionary mindset found within a settled community facing the prospect of unwelcome change. Eliot began writing the two pieces that would eventually form Middlemarch during the years 1869–70 and completed the novel in 1871. Although the first reviews were mixed, it is now widely regarded as her best work and one of the greatest novels written in English. Background, composition and publication. Middlemarch originates in two unfinished pieces that Eliot worked on during the years 1869 and 1870, the novel, Middlemarch, and the long story, Miss Brooke. The former piece is first mentioned in her journal on the 1st of January 1869 as one of the tasks for the coming year. In August she began writing, but progress ceased in the following month amidst a lack of confidence about it and distraction caused by the illness of George Henry Lewis's son, Thorny, who was dying of tuberculosis. Following Thorny's death on the 19th of October 1869, all work on the novel stopped. It is uncertain at this point whether or not Eliot intended to revive it at a later date. In December she writes of having begun another story on a subject that she had considered ever since I began to write fiction. By the end of the month she had written 100 pages of this story and entitled it Miss Brooke. Although a precise date is unknown, the process of incorporating material from Middlemarch into the story she had been working on was ongoing by March 1871. In the process of composition, Eliot compiled a notebook of hundreds of literary quotations including excerpts from poets, historians, playwrights, philosophers, and critics in 8 different languages. By May 1871, the growing length of the novel had become a concern to Eliot, as it threatened to exceed the 3-volume format that was the norm in publishing. The issue was compounded by the fact that Eliot's most recent novel, Felix Holt, also set in the same pre-reform Bill England, had not sold well. The publisher John Blackwood, who had made a loss on acquiring the English rights to the novel, was approached by Lewis in his role as Eliot's literary agent. He suggested that the novel be brought out in 8 two-monthly parts, borrowing from the method of Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables. This was an alternative to the monthly issuing that had occurred for such longer works as David Copperfield and Vanity Fair, and it avoided the objections of Eliot herself to the cutting up of her novel into small parts. Blackwood agreed to the venture, though he acknowledged there will be complaints of a want of the continuous interest in the story due to the independence of each volume. The 8 books duly appeared throughout 1872, the last 3 installments being issued monthly. With the deaths of William Makepeace Thackeray and Charles Dickens, Eliot was generally recognized as the greatest living English novelist at the time of the novel's final publication. Plot: Middlemarch is written as a third-person narrative centering on the lives of the residents of Middlemarch, a fictitious Midlands town. From 1829 onwards, the years preceding the 1832 Reform Act, the narrative is variably considered to consist of 3 or 4 plots of unequal emphasis: the life of Dorothea Brooke, the career of Tertius Lydgate, the courtship of Mary Garth by Fred Vincy, and the disgrace of Bulstrode. The 2 main plots are those of Dorothea and Lydgate. Each plot happens concurrently, although Bulstrode's is centered in the later chapters. Dorothea Brooke appears set for a comfortable and idle life as the wife of neighboring landowner Sir James Chetham, but to the dismay of her sister Celia and her uncle Mr. Brooke, she marries the Reverend Edward Kassebaum, expecting fulfillment by sharing in his intellectual life. Dorothea discovers his animosity towards her ambitions during an unhappy honeymoon in Rome. Realizing his great project is doomed to failure, her feelings change to pity. Dorothea forms a warm friendship with a young cousin of Casaubon's, Ladislaw, but her husband's antipathy towards him is clear and he is forbidden to visit. In poor health, Kassebaum attempts to extract from Dorothea a promise that, should he die, she will avoid doing what I should deprecate, and apply yourself to do what I should desire. Quote, he dies before she is able to reply, and she later learns of a provision to his will that, if she marries Ladislaw, she will lose her inheritance. The young Dr. Tertius Lydgate arrives in Middlemarch. Through his voluntary hospital work he meets the town's financier, Mr. Bulstrode, and through him Bulstrode's niece, the mayor's beautiful daughter Rosamund Vincy. Rosamund is attracted to Lydgate, particularly by what she believes to be his aristocratic connections. They marry, and in Lydgate's efforts to please Rosamund is soon deeply in debt and forced to seek help from Bulstrode. He is partly sustained through this by his friendship with Camdon Fairbrother. Meanwhile, Rosamund's brother, Fred, is reluctantly destined for the church. He is in love with his childhood sweetheart, Mary Garth, who will not accept him until he abandons the church and settles on a more suitable career. At one time Fred had been bequeathed a considerable fortune by Mr. Featherston, but Featherston later rescinded this will. However, Featherston, on his deathbed, begs Mary to destroy this second will. Mary refuses and begs Featherston to wait until the morning when a new legal will can be drawn up, but he dies before being able to. In debt, Fred is forced to take out the loan guaranteed by Mary's father, Caleb Garth. Then, when Fred cannot pay the loan, Caleb Garth's finances become compromised. This humiliation shocks Fred into reassessing his life, and he resolves to train as a land agent under the forgiving Caleb. John Raffles, who knows of Bulstrode's shady past, appears in Middlemarch with the intent to blackmail him. In his youth, the church-going Bulstrode engaged in questionable financial dealings, and his fortune is founded on a marriage to a much older, wealthy widow. Bulstrode's terror of public exposure as a hypocrite leads him to hasten the death of the mortally sick Raffles, though word has already spread. Bulstrode's disgrace engulfs Lydgate, as knowledge of the financier's loan to the doctor becomes known, and he is assumed to be complicit with Bulstrode. Only Dorothea and Fairbrother maintain faith in him, but nonetheless Lydgate and Rosamund are encouraged by the general opprobrium to leave Middlemarch. The disgraced and reviled Bulstrode's only consolation is that his wife stands by him as he too faces exile. The peculiar nature of Casaubon's will leads to suspicion that Ladislaw and Dorothea are lovers, creating an awkwardness between the two. Ladislaw is secretly in love with Dorothea, but keeps that to himself, having no desire to involve her in scandal that could cause her disinheritance. He remains in Middlemarch, working as a newspaper editor for Mr. Brooke. When Brooke's election campaign collapses, he decides to leave the town and visits Dorothea to make his farewell. But Dorothea has also fallen in love with Ladislaw, whom she had previously seen only as her husband's unfortunate relative. However, the peculiar nature idea of Kassebaum's will led her to begin to see him in a new light. Renouncing Kassebaum's fortune, she shocks her family again by announcing that she will marry Ladislaw. At the same time, Fred, who has been successful in his career, marries Mary. The finale details the eventual fortunes of the main characters. Fred and Mary marry and live contentedly with the 3 sons. Lydgate operates a practice outside of Middlemarch but never finds fulfillment and dies aged 50, leaving Rosamund and 4 children. After he dies, Rosamund marries a wealthy physician. Ladislaw engages in public reform and Dorothea proves to be contented as a wife and mother to the 2 children. The son inherits Arthur Brooke's estate. Characters: Dorothea Brooke, an intelligent, wealthy woman with great aspirations. Dorothea avoids displaying her wealth and embarks upon projects such as redesigning cottages for her uncle's tenants. She marries the elderly Reverend Edward Kassebaum, with the idealistic idea of helping him with his research project, the key to all mythologies. However, the marriage was a mistake, as Kassebaum does not take her seriously and resents her youth, enthusiasm, and energy. Her requests to assist him makes it more difficult for him to conceal that his research is years out of date. Because of Kassebaum's coldness during the honeymoon, Dorothea becomes friends with his relative, Will Ladislaw. Some years after Kassebaum's death, she falls in love with Will and marries him. Tertius Lydgate, an idealistic, talented, but naive young doctor, and though of good birth, he is relatively poor. Lydgate hopes to make great advancements in medicine through his research. However, he ends up in an unhappy marriage to Rosamund Vincy. His attempts to show that he is not answerable to any man fail and he eventually has to leave town. He ends up sacrificing all of his high ideals in order to please his wife. Rev. Edward Kassebaum, K.S. Ben, a pedantic, selfish, elderly clergyman who is obsessed with his scholarly research. Because of this, his marriage to Dorothea is loveless. His unfinished book, The Key to All Mythologies, is intended as a monument to the tradition of Christian syncretism. However, his research is out of date because he does not read German. He is aware of this but will not admit it to anyone. Mary Garth, the practical, plain, and kind daughter of Caleb and Susan Garth, she works as Mr. Featherstone's nurse. She and Fred Vincy were childhood sweethearts, but she refuses to allow him to woo her until he shows himself willing and able to live seriously, practically, and sincerely. Arthur Brooke, the often befuddled and none too clever uncle of Dorothea and Celia Brooke. He has a reputation as the worst landlord in the county, but stands for Parliament on a reform platform. Celia Brooke, Dorothea's younger sister, is a great beauty. She is more sensual than Dorothea and does not share her sister's idealism and asceticism, and is only too happy to marry Sir James Chetham. When Dorothea rejects him, Sir James Chetham, a neighbouring landowner, Sir James is in love with Dorothea and helps her with her plans to improve conditions for the tenants. When she marries Kassebaum, he marries Celia Brooke. Rosamund Vincy, vain, beautiful, and shallow. Rosamund has a high opinion of her own charms and a low opinion of Middlemarch society. She marries Tertius Lydgate because she believes that he will raise her social standing and keep her comfortable. When her husband encounters financial difficulties, she thwarts his efforts to economize, seeing such sacrifices as beneath her and insulting. She is unable to bear the idea of losing status in Middlemarch society. Fred Vincy, Rosamund's brother, who has loved Mary Garth from childhood. His family hopes that he will advance his class standing by becoming a clergyman, but he knows that Mary will not marry him if he does so. Brought up expecting an inheritance from his uncle Mr. Featherston, he is a spendthrift. He later changes because of his love for Mary, and finds, by studying under Mary's father, a profession through which he gains Mary's respect. Will Ladislaw, a young cousin of Mr. Kassebaum. He has no property because his grandmother married a poor Polish musician and was disinherited. He is a man of great verve, idealism and talent, but of no fixed profession. He is in love with Dorothea, but cannot marry her without her losing Mr. Kassebaum's property. Humphrey Cadwallader and Eleanor Cadwallader, neighbors of the Brookes. Mr. Cadwallader is a rector. Mrs. Cadwallader is a pragmatic and talkative woman who comments on local affairs with wry cynicism. She disapproves of Dorothea's marriage and Mr. Brooke's parliamentary endeavors. Walter Vincey and Lucy Vincey, a respectable manufacturing family. They wish their children to advance socially, and are disappointed by both Rosamund's and Fred's marriages. Mr. Vincey's sister is married to Nikolas Bulstrode. Mrs. Vincey was an innkeeper's daughter and her sister was the second wife of Mr. Featherston. Caleb Garth, Mary Garth's father. He is a kind, honest, and generous businessman who is a sovereign land agent involved in farm management. He is fond of Fred and eventually takes him under his wing. Camdon Fairbrother, a poor but clever vicar and amateur naturalist. He is a friend of Lydgate and Fred Vincey, and loves Mary Garth. His position improves when Dorothea appoints him to a living after Kassebaum's death. Nikolas Bulstrode, wealthy bank married to Mr. Vincey's sister, Harriet. He is a pious Methodist who tries to impose his beliefs in Middlemarch society. However, he also has a sordid past which he is desperate to hide. His religion favors his personal desires, and is devoid of sympathy for others. Peter Featherston, old landlord of Stone Court, a self-made man who married Caleb Garth's sister and later took Mrs. Vincey's sister as his second wife when his first wife died. Jane Wall, a widow and Peter Featherstone's sister, has a son, John. Mr. Hawley, foul-mouthed businessman and enemy of Bulstrode. Mr. Mormsey, grocer. Dr. Sprague, Middlemarch doctor. Mr. Tyke, clergyman favoured by Bulstrode. Rig Featherston, Featherstone's illegitimate son who appears at the reading of Featherstone's will and is given his fortune instead of Fred. He is also related to John Raffles, who comes into town to visit Rig but instead reveals Bulstrode's past. His appearance in the novel is crucial to the plot. John Raffles. Raffles is a braggart and a bully, a humorous scoundrel in the tradition of Sir John Falstaff, and an alcoholic. But unlike Shakespeare's Fat Knight, Raffles is a genuinely evil man. He holds the key to Bulstrode's dark past and Lydgate's future. Historical novel. The action of Middlemarch takes place between September 1829 and May 1832, or 40 years prior to its publication during 1871–2, a gap in time not so pronounced for it to be regularly labelled as a historical novel. By comparison, Walter Scott's Waverley, often regarded as the first major historical novel, takes place some 60 years before its publication. Eliot had previously written a more obviously historical novel in Romola, set in 15th-century Florence. Critics Kathleen Blake and Michael York Mason opine that there has been insufficient attention given to Middlemarch as a historical novel that evokes the past in relation to the present. Critic Rosemary Ashton notes that the lack of attention to this aspect of the novel might indicate its merits in this regard. Is that very rare thing, a successful historical novel. In fact, it is so successful that we scarcely think of it in terms of that subgenre of fiction. For its contemporary readership, the present was the passage of the Second Reform Act in 1867, the agitation for the Reform Act of 1832 and its turbulent passage through the two Houses of Parliament, which provide the basic structure of the novel, would have been considered the past. Although regularly categorized as a historical novel, Middlemarch's attention to historical detail has been recurrently noticed by critics critics. In his 1873 review, Henry James recognized that Eliot's purpose was to be a generous rural historian. Elsewhere, Eliot has been described as adopting the role of imaginative historian, even scientific investigator in Middlemarch, and her narrator, as conscious of the historiographical questions involved in writing a social and political history of provincial life. This narrator compares the novel to a work of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who is often described as the father of history. Themes: a study of provincial life. Eliot's novel is set in the fictional town of Middlemarch, North Loamshire, which is probably based on Coventry, in the county of Warwickshire, where she had lived prior to moving to London. Like Coventry, Middlemarch is described as being a silk ribbon manufacturing town. The subtitle of the novel, A Study of Provincial Life, has been viewed as significant, with one critic viewing the unity of Middlemarch as being achieved through the fusion of the two senses of provincial, that is, on the one hand the geographical, meaning all parts of the country except the capital, and on the other hand, a person who is unsophisticated or narrow-minded. Caroline Steedman considers Eliot's emphasis on provincialism in Middlemarch in relation to Matthew Arnold's discussion of social class in England in his series of essays Culture and Anarchy, published in 1869, around the time Eliot began working on the stories which would become Middlemarch. In that series, Arnold classifies British society in terms of the barbarians, Philistines and populace, and Steedman suggests that Middlemarch is a portrait of Philistine provincialism. It is worth noting that Eliot went to London, unlike her heroine Dorothea, where she achieved fame way beyond most women of her time, and certainly more than Dorothea, who remained in the provinces. Eliot was rejected by her family once she had established her common-law relationship with Lewis, and the profound disapproval prevented her ever going home again, and she did not visit Coventry during her last visit to the Midlands in 1855. The woman question. Central to Middlemarch is the idea that Dorothea Brooke cannot hope to achieve the heroic stature of a figure like St. Teresa, because Eliot's heroine lives at the wrong time, amidst the conditions of an imperfect social state, in which great feelings will often take the aspect of error, and great faith the aspect of illusion. Antigone, a figure from Greek mythology best known from Sophocles' play Antigone, is given in the finale as a further example of a heroic woman. Literary critic Kathleen Blake notes that George Eliot emphasizes St. Teresa's very concrete accomplishment, the reform of a religious order, rather than the fact that she was a Christian mystic. A frequent criticism by feminist critics has been that Dorothea is not only less heroic than St. Teresa and Antigone, but also George Eliot herself. In response, both Ruth Yeasel and Kathleen Blake chide these critics for expecting literary pictures of a strong woman succeeding in a period that did not make them likely in life. Eliot has also been criticized more widely for ending the novel with Dorothea marrying a man, Ladislaw, so clearly her inferior. The author Henry James describes Ladislaw as a dilettante and feels that he has not the concentrated fervor essential in the man chosen by so nobly strenuous a heroine. Marriage. Marriage is one of the major themes in Middlemarch as, according to critic Francis George Steiner, both principal plots are case studies of unsuccessful marriage. Within this account is the suggestion that the lives of Dorothea and Lydgate are unfilled because of these disastrous marriages. This is arguably more the case for Lydgate than for Dorothea, who obtains a second chance through her eventual marriage to Ladislaw. However, a favorable interpretation of this marriage is dependent upon the character of Ladislaw himself, whom numerous critics have viewed as Dorothea's inferior. In addition to these marriages, there is the meaningless and blissful marriage of Dorothea's sister Celia Brooke to Sir James Chetham and, more significantly, Fred Vince's courting of Mary Garth. In this latter story, Mary Garth will not accept Fred until he abandons the church and settles on a more suitable career. In this regard, Fred resembles Henry Fielding's character Tom Jones, both characters being moulded into a good husband by the love they give to and receive from a woman. Dorothea is a St. Teresa, born in the wrong century, in provincial Middlemarch, who mistakes in her idealistic ardor a poor dry mummified pedant as a sort of angel of vocation. Middlemarch is, in part, a Bildungsroman, a literary genre focusing on the psychological and moral growth of the protagonist, in which Dorothea blindly gropes forward, making mistakes in her sometimes foolish, often egotistical, but also admirably idealistic attempt to find a role, or vocation, with which to fulfill her nature. Lydgate is equally mistaken in his choice of marriage partner, because his idea for a perfect wife is someone who can sing and play the piano and provide a soft cushion for her husband to rest after work. He therefore marries Rosamund Vincy, the woman in the novel who most contrasts with Dorothea, with the result that he deteriorates from ardent researcher to fashionable doctor in London.